So I'd like to welcome everyone to the SSA workshop, Responsive Archival Instruction in a Global Pandemic. My name is Amy Allen. I'm a member of the SSA Professional Development Committee. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us today. I will be moderating the session, so you can send me a private chat if you're having issues. And now I'm going to turn it over to our trainers, Julie Tanaka and Claudia Willett.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. My name's Julie. We'll do formal introductions shortly. Thank you for joining us this morning or early afternoon, I think, for some of you. We acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples, including the Acoma Otham, Pima, and Peepash Maricopa Indian community, whose care and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. As we begin, we'd like to set some workshop norms and agreements. We welcome you to turn on your camera, but you're not obligated to do so in order to participate. We also ask that you mute your microphones unless you are speaking to the group or in one of the breakout rooms. If you're comfortable, we invite you to check your display name and add your preferred pronouns. We also would like this to be a safe and trusting space for open dialogue and not debate. Finally, the workshop requires active participation, humble listening, and we also ask that you speak with kindness. Now, I mentioned my name was Julie. My name is Julie Tanaka. I'm the rare book and manuscript curator at the Asu Library. I've got some experience teaching online and learning. As you can tell, this whole Zoom advancing slides thing isn't normally what I do. But I'm filled with a lot of ideas and enthusiasm about instruction for the upcoming academic year. Joining me today is my colleague, Claudia, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Claudia Willett. I'm an archivist at the ASU Library. This was my first year transitioning to teaching and learning online. So it was a really great experience for me. And so that has made it really inspiring to offer workshops like this and to talk to people about our transition. And I'm nervous about this upcoming year only because there's going to be a flood of people back to campus, which will, offer different challenges, but I'm excited because we have a lot of interesting opportunities coming up. And the co-developer of our project, Allison, could not be with us for this presentation, but we wanted to make sure she was included here, that you got a sense of who she is. She's the undergraduate instruction and outreach librarian at ASU Library. She does instruction all the time. So she was doing synchronous and asynchronous instruction way before the pandemic. And she's also looking forward to our future opportunities, and we'll talk about some of them during the session. So thank you, and we're excited to get going.
We have an obligatory slide here of our cats, Claudia's cats, and my cat. Their official job functions. So they're joining us today in spirit, and you may see Claudia's cats reappear across her screen at some point in time.
It is without fail that at least one of them will show up. So I just wanted to fully disclose that possibility. Don't be alarmed if you just see a tail or something.
All right, back to a little more serious things. We're going to be spending a good chunk of time together, so we thought we would give everyone the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better. Hopefully this will help encourage discussion and chat and everything else. So what we'd like to do is give everyone an opportunity to get out there and talk about a few questions that we have here on the screen. We thought we'd send you out into breakout rooms for about 5 minutes so you can get to know each other, and then we'll come back together, and then maybe if one person from each group could kind of compile a general summary of geographic locations that are represented in your group and who you are, that would be great. Any questions before I ask Amy to or Claudia to send us out into breakout rooms. What we did for our workshop is we broke it down to 3 main parts. So the presentation session, which we're in right now, Claudia and I will walk you through some of the things that we did in terms of developing an online, what turned into an online instruction unit. The second part of the workshop will be a demonstration that'll contain activities for everyone to engage in. And then the final part of the workshop, which we did leave a good chunk of time, we have some group work and things like that, but also really to talk about ideas of what's going on at your institutions, future plans, so on and so forth, questions, hopefully a lot of good ideas. And it sounds like that'll happen. So what we're going to do in the first hour, and for whatever reason my slides aren't behaving, we're going to talk about the Archival Instruction Toolkit, followed by the Instruction Framework that was developed, and then going with the flow. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Claudia. Oops, wrong way.
Great. Oh my God, it's happening just one second. Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Claudia Willett. I'm a processing archivist at ASU Library. And so this is pretty exciting for me to be able to talk about my other passion, instruction. So we'll start with talking about how we developed the instruction toolkit and how we were able to leverage this work into online instruction when everything changed last spring.
Claudia, you're going to have to say next because I can't tell where the slides are.
Okay,
So.
next. So the impetus for the instruction toolkit was based around this question: when did you first learn about archives? My colleague Allenston and I had a conversation with each other and realized that our initial experiences with archival exposure were completely different. I grew up in a house with a librarian for a mom, and I had a lot of exposure pretty early on, to the point where I knew when I was 16 that I wanted to be an archivist, which is pretty wild for a 16-year-old, I think. Whereas Allenston didn't really learn about archives until she was in her undergraduate experience. And it wasn't until she learned that Beyonce had an archivist that she learned about archives at all. And then she was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So having that conversation with each other really sparked our motivation for this project. Next. So the ASU charter also contributed to how we thought about developing this project. The design of the toolkit aims to teach students K through 16 basic archival literacy skills. So the intention is rooted in whom we include and how they succeed, and advancing research and discovery of public value, and viewing it as a fundamental responsibility to our shared communities. Next. So we wanted the toolkit to create a clear and unencumbered first memory of learning about archives. We both recognized that we could pinpoint that moment, but that isn't true for everyone. And we thought that that was an important aspect of developing these literacies and skills. Students can develop the important understanding that an archive can reflect cultural and social biases and power structures in place at any given holding institution. And so that was another motivating factor, that it isn't just the work that we're doing, but that this is something that can be applied externally and basically anywhere. So we'll start here by introducing you to instruction at ASU Library and how this also helped us frame this project. Next. So the library side, the way that our institution is organized, there is a library side and a collections and archives side. So the library side instruction, engagement and learning services offers a lot of introduction to library instruction and access points. It's a really great model, and we'll cover some of that over the next couple of slides. Next. So the first thing that's really great on Ask a Librarian, they have an immediate access point to how do you learn more about ASU Library, and do you have tutorials about general research skills? Both of those are great assets. Next. And then they offer a very clear way to connect with librarians, breaking it down even by subject specialty. Next. And they have a library orientation LibGuide, which is really helpful. It can be utilized and engaged by anyone, anywhere. A faculty member could use this without engaging any librarian resources or time at all. So this is really great model too. Next. And they have an action button where you can request library instruction. So these are all things that represented a great model, like I mentioned, for what we wanted to achieve with this overall toolkit project. Next. Conversely, distinctive collections and archives doesn't have as uniform of a presence for instruction. A lot of the time it is faculty reaching out to a specific curator, doing something really subject specific, and then that's kind of it. There's nothing else that really follows that. And that it often isn't communicated to the teams that instruction has occurred, what the topic was even, and what was covered. So there's a lot of ambiguity and lack of clarity as far as that goes. Next. Our Ask an Archivist FAQ doesn't mention instruction at all, but all of the questions could be answered by a standardized bibliographic instruction session. So this, once we recognized this, we realized that we were starting to move in the right direction with developing this toolkit. Next. And our web page doesn't really offer any dynamic resources either. Connect with us doesn't lead anywhere. Not a great sign or a start. So something that we definitely need to work on as far as our web presence, but it also is a reason why we wanted to kind of consolidate the idea of an introduction to archives instruction access tool. And are interested in a collection doesn't lead you to curators, it leads you back to Ask an Archivist, which isn't going to be very helpful if you came here from there. So it's a little bit of a circle that doesn't really result in a positive user or patron interaction. And what's really confusing is that there is clearly instruction going on for special collections, distinctive collections. We just don't know about it. And it isn't widely shared. And it makes it really hard to know like what foundation is being laid for students. When are they getting this interaction? When are they, like how often are they interacting with a curator or with archival material? There isn't a way to really capture that information at this point, but we do know in total this is occurring. So wanting to really create a way to have a quantifiable outcome that we can point to was also a motivating factor for developing this broad-ranging, flexible toolkit. we're just rolling with it.
We're
So
rolling with the thing, and for some reason it disappeared.
yeah, that's weird, but it's okay. So another, whoops, there we go.
You're right. Okay.
Another component that really made a difference in developing this toolkit was leveraging multiple teams in the library to really amplify cross-library goals, but also supporting distinctive collections, engagement, and outreach. Next. So for the development, it was essential to work across units and directorates. So again, we have 4 directorates, and within those directorates, we have various units. And so we leveraged 2 directorates and varied professional skills to develop this toolkit. So we were able to have someone whose main focus is instruction kind of lead our organization of these kinds of ideas, while we were able to, Julie and I were able to bring in a more nuanced perspective about archival literacy, archival research, and using those particular types of records. Next.
I think I went too far. Am I too far?
Can you go back one?
This one?
Oh, yeah. So because we had all of those great connections, interdirectorate and interunit, there were some really positive outcomes that came along with our early stages of developing the toolkit. Developing student success opportunities, developing archives and distinctive collection success opportunities, and developing colleague success opportunities. We'll talk about that a little bit during the demonstration of the module, but all of this was really borne out in our pilot of the toolkit, and it was really empowering to see that our idea worked to accomplish these really important goals. Next. Some issues we did run into inside of collections when we wanted to develop this program was a reluctance to collaborate and a misunderstanding of our intention. So a lot of us can relate to the fact that archivists and special collections librarians are very busy and have a lot on their plates. And so it's hard to imagine adding one more thing, even if it's working with a colleague, especially when you know that you're already performing this sort of work just independent of the rest of the team. And so that also facilitated an issue with a misunderstanding of our intention, where people were kind of reluctant and, you know, concerned that if we developed this, they would lose opportunities at instruction and we would be, you know, taking their thunder for opportunities to engage their collections, which was not the intention. We're not focused on subject-specific instruction necessarily. So we had some internal hurdles to kind of get over to really get this into a place where it could be successful and utilized by our colleagues. Next. And the other really big factor, as everyone knows, is faculty buy-in and support. So every conversation is an opportunity. Your colleagues are your best advertisers. These 2 things are how we got connected to the English faculty member that brought us in to pilot the toolkit, and seeking objectives and outcomes that can be interdisciplinary. So when we initially started talking about the toolkit, we thought about piloting it in intro to history classes, but we ended up piloting it in a research methods English course. So really working to have our objectives and outcomes be broad enough to be applicable in a variety of environments really enabled us to be able to make a case for our toolkit in a different setting than we imagined. We've come to our first mini break. We will pause for a moment. If there are questions or comments, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we will we'll get to them, and then we'll head back in.
Now we'd like to move into the Toolkit Framework. Next slide. So the toolkit includes a set of lesson plans and presentation decks that are customizable, and that was one of the most important things, so that they could be set up to align with course themes and objectives. And also, we wanted them to establish a consistent foundation of archival knowledge across all of ASU and our partner communities. So each plan has defined objectives for instructors to use as a framework for introducing their students to archival literacy and critical assessment. And all of this we've set up so that it's done with an emphasis on ASU's collections, and especially the collections here that contain unrepresented voices. The toolkit was originally created for synchronous face-to-face instruction, but as we all know, COVID-19 hit. So we had to roll with the changes, and we transformed from the face-to-face instruction to online instruction as a pilot program, and we launched that in fall of 2020. So one of the units is called Archives 101. Next. Upon developing the toolkit, we collectively discussed our initial memories of learning about archives and research with primary sources, and the importance of framing this project around the idea that all learners are not at a deficit, but rather they come with different levels of exposure and different ideas. So we wanted to embrace that. We really did want to focus on individual experiences and how those experiences offer a unique and opportunity for all of the students to engage and apply the concepts that they hear about in our instruction unit to the work that they're doing. So Archives 101 that you see here on the screen is a bibliographic instruction session, and it provides a clear introduction to the fundamentals of archives. The first question we use to initiate the conversation in the session is, what is archives? Followed by the second question, what is an archivist? Because if they don't understand these basic concepts, it's hard to have a conversation and talk about archival research. Next. For our bibliographic instruction, one example of what we did is shown here. This was designed for a synchronous instruction session. So you can see how it's broken down into different units, 5 minutes of introduction, again, the basic concepts, followed by our 2 questions. There's an instruction presentation, and then we spend the last 5 minutes to make sure we can wrap things up, summarize, have students summarize for us to make sure they're all on the same page. In Archives 102, next. Here you have another example of one of our instruction sessions. This is the archival research instruction session. It builds upon the information from the bibliographic instruction session. And so what you have there on the left side of your screen is a sample of one of the lesson plans. This one happens to focus on information literacy and using primary sources. So we go through and we talk about the different types of sources, and then primary, secondary, tertiary sources. And we also move into talking about ideas like the differences between digital surrogates and original records and how they're described. In fall 2020, we had the opportunity to start the archival instruction pilot, and this was embedded into a week-long module for an English course called Methods of Inquiry, taught by one of ASU's English professors, Professor Ellie Long. And we customized the Archives 102 module so that it would align with her course objectives. It consisted of 3 50-minute sessions in which we used information sharing, interactive group exercises, and chat for conversation questions and real-time feedback. And we also invited our colleague, Jessica Salo, who is part of our community-driven archives team at ASU, to put our concepts and objectives into action, and also into context using ASU's collections. Again, these are our collections that represent some of the unrepresented voices. Next. In this slide and the next slide, we're going to have a couple of examples here of our research instruction. This is the first component on the slide you're viewing, where we introduce students to our primary sources in archival research. We also focus on establishing a strong foundation of the core concepts. And then in the next slide, this is what we're calling setup number 2. This focuses on students developing their skills that they'll need to conduct archival research for a specific classroom assignment, subject, or skill. And again, you can see how all of these have kind of the basic format, where we start with the introduction, basic concepts, instruction presentations, some sort of this one has a hands-on activity where we send them out, and then it has a classroom assignment as well as the wrap-up at the end. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Claudia.
Yes, great. So we really wanted to focus on the idea of breaking down barriers to use in these instruction sessions. So like Julie just outlined, we created these basic templates that we could use to facilitate a conversation with an interested professor and demonstrate how there was space to, apply whatever their objectives or outcomes were, or things that aligned with what we already had developed as potential outcomes and learning objectives. But most importantly, we really wanted to focus on the gatekeeping aspects of some of this information and breaking down those barriers. So the first point that we really wanted to focus on was physical access. So in order to foster more opportunities for physical engagement, you have to create more opportunities. So like I said, that was really a driving factor, a goal of ours for developing this toolkit to provide. So I don't want to read this whole thing to you. I know you can see it, but we really wanted it to be something that was usable in an interdisciplinary way, whether it's about formats, time periods, geographies, whatever the focus was, we wanted it to apply across the learner spectrum. We really also wanted to create a bridge from physical access to intellectual access. So really understanding the stuff and understanding how to use and analyze the stuff. So in the toolkit, we used interactive activities to really kind of drive home their understanding, the learner's understanding of the skills that we presented, and also to offer a low risk opportunity for failure. If they didn't get it, that was okay, because it wasn't an assignment, it was just in-course, in-session work, and still allowed them to demonstrate to us whether we had effectively conveyed that information or not, and be able to kind of work backwards and have that conversation in real time, instead of them struggling with whatever came next in the course.
All right, so now we're going to take a look at the toolkit and how it goes and flows. Again, the theme of going with the flow. Next. One of the questions that we asked ourselves was, how can we really have a meaningful experience in this wonderful global pandemic that we found ourselves immersed in? So basically, the pandemic came, it flipped the switch on the type of teaching that most of us were accustomed to doing. And so the question that I asked myself, and my colleagues had similar versions, was how can we rise to the challenge and provide our students with something meaningful, a meaningful learning experience that would be beneficial to them, and on top of that, as an added benefit, would perhaps enhance our own skills. Next. So as we were thinking about this, we turned to this comment that Ibram X. Kendi made, and really the core issue here is not what individuals are not doing, what parents aren't doing, what teachers aren't doing, but rather addressing the larger structural factors that impact what happens in the classroom. So we thought about this, opportunity gap versus achievement gap. And for us here, we really started to focus on this idea of the opportunity gap. We knew that our students had varied experiences as they came in, and we wanted to encourage them to draw on those experiences in a positive way and use them as they analyze the sources. We tried to get them to see that their experiences were a tool, a useful tool, and that it gave them unique skills, ideas. It was something that also empowered them. It gave them control over what they were looking at. And the hope was that they would become more and more engaged in the research because they had a vital stake in it. And then in turn, they would share their ideas. Next. So this was intended for, face-to-face synchronous instruction, where there was individual reflection analysis to begin with, and then we would get students involved to work with one another so that they could share their experiences and their perspectives. And then finally, together, they would work together and then produce a collaborative answer to the question, what is an archive? What is an archivist? Next slide. As part of our face-to-face instruction, it was really about providing students with a full immersive experience. And one aspect of this is really giving students a chance to get their hands on and to work with an object. And in the background there, you see a book, and this, I'm gonna put book in scare quotes, right? This is from our contemporary artist book collection, and it was something to engage the students. It was familiar, bookish, but yet it was kind of different. And they would come out, and the intention was for them to sit there and investigate it without us telling them much about it at the beginning, to feel the different textures, to look at the colors, to look at the information contained in it. Their own backgrounds would bring something different. Some people were fascinated by the fact that these were beetles. Other people were fascinated by the colors used and the textures on the paper. We encourage them to use all their senses except for not tasting it, because that would have been a good idea. Next. But all of a sudden we couldn't do this. We couldn't have that physical, tactile, hands-on environment. So we transitioned into a virtual environment, but we still wanted to keep this meaningful. So we turned to a flipped classroom method, assigning readings before class so people had background before they came in, kind of hit the ground running. We utilized breakout rooms to give people an opportunity to do different activities to break down. Oftentimes they're more comfortable working or talking about this with 2 or 3 people rather than in a room of 15 or 20. So we sat here and figured out what the most meaningful learning experience would be in this new setting. We encountered some challenges, such as the whole electronic mode and things not always working. But we also found that it was hard to find appropriate digital items from our collections that align with the course, especially suddenly when we didn't have the time to digitize things and have them prepared. It was also difficult to map out exercises that would continue to create space for active learning. And at the same time, we did find some positive things in that we could find digital assets that complemented the toolkit as we moved into the online mode. And we also gained the opportunity to teach with, or to co-teach with our colleagues. Next. So as we transitioned, it quickly became apparent that we had to talk about digital collections and digital surrogates. So we started off by introducing again to the core concepts that we talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, defining what a digital surrogate was and reasons why they're created, because they serve different purposes. It's not just about having an electronic copy of an item, right? Sometimes it's for archival preservation, other times it's to increase accessibility and other ideas like that. Next. And then in terms of the digital surrogate itself, to hit home, we presented a digital surrogate. So here you see one. And we asked all of our students about this with some key questions. What does the digital surrogate prevent you from doing, seeing, or understanding? How does it fail as an imitation of the original? Flip side, does it succeed? And how is its operation similar to or different than the experience you would have is if you were sitting there looking at the original object? So some of the things that you miss, you don't see the 23 karat gold that's actually on the image. You don't feel the texture of the paper. You don't really notice in the digital surrogate, even if you enlarge it, that it's hand colored with iridescent watercolors. And also here, you don't realize that this isn't a normal single cut page from a book, but rather it's part of a accordion fold that you would extend out, that you saw 2 slides earlier when I had the full book out. So you do miss quite a bit. Next, I'm gonna pass it back to Claudia.
So yes, where are we going now that we have managed to launch the toolkit in an online environment and it went fairly well, I like to think. What are we going to do next? We'll touch on some of this later in considering what you might need or want in your instruction development. But to close out the intro to the toolkit, we wanted to share a few things about our experience. Sorry, I'm wrestling with the cat. Okay, so what's next? We had such a great experience with Ellie Long, Dr. Long, that she invited us to collaborate on an asynchronous module, or 2-week module for an English required course over the summer and to be used multiple times in multiple iterations after that. And so we'll be focusing again on those same kinds of ideas, but crafting it to meet the expectations of this new foundational course that they're offering online only. And we're hoping that in working on this collaborative project with the English department, that we will find other opportunities to be embedded in curriculum, supporting other courses, either in the English department or again, leveraging those connections and conversations to find other ways to point back at these other successes to say, we could do something like this for you. We also have some toolkit goals. Now that we have these outlines of lesson plans, these basically formatted slide decks that we can kind of launch when we need to, what can we do next? We're looking at creating tutorials, so little like 3 to 5 minute clips that sort of do what each slide or each segment of an in-person or asynchronous instruction would do. But this way, the professor could play it in their own class or could make it be a pre-session assignment. So again, coming in with that foundation a little bit elevated by having these resources that faculty or teachers can use at their own discretion. Similarly, videos, doing a walkthrough of the reading room, doing a walkthrough of the process of requesting material, requesting a research appointment, all of those kinds of things to kind of take the edge off, to make it more approachable, but without us having to come into the classroom to take up time. I mean, we talk about not having enough time in class, but faculty also run into these concerns. So developing these kinds of assets. And also we had a really interesting conversation in a workshop last week with a history teacher who's also responsible for the ESL program in her school. And she asked us about assets like this that are really slowed down, broken down, include a lot of gestures and clear sort of cueing for non-English speaking or English as a second language students. And we were like, we don't know of anything, and we hadn't thought about that, but yes. So now we really want to focus on accessibility as a component of this too. And so these are the kinds of conversations we really want to be having. So just to point to the fact that we are looking forward to the discussion later this afternoon. But that is another goal that we've started thinking about. And then we have our library guide, but using it as a place to sort of store all of these pieces as we develop them, so we can point people to this central location and not have to send them to in that vicious circle of not quite the information they're looking for, and ultimately probably dissuading a lot of people from engaging our instruction and specialty. So now we are going to take you through a demonstration of our instruction toolkit and some of the stuff we did specifically in our pilot. This is just to remind you what we're doing and where we're heading, managing everyone's expectations. This is a very long time to be on Zoom. And just want to do a quick check-in again, if anything came up for you in the time that we had a break. Please feel free to drop it in the chat or share it now. We want to try and get to your questions when you have them. So don't hesitate to ask anything. But if everyone's feeling okay, we will get rolling. So what we will do in this next hour is take you through some of the background information and context for developing this specific module this week of sessions, and generally our goals for the toolkit in action. And then we will have some time for discussion at the end, where we are really hoping to get into some of the questions that will drive our workshopping time at the end of our time together. So that's what we're planning to cover in this next hour. So hope everyone's ready. Here we go.
Hi, everyone. So we're going to start with the background for our fall 2020 module. And next, our big question was, are we a good fit? Right? Are we a good fit for the class? Next. So one of the things that we did is we took a look here at the course description, and we noticed that it said, focusing on studying of writing, rhetoric, and literacy, there were some key things that jumped out to us. And you can see these highlighted on the slide here in black. It's odd to say highlighted in black, but okay. That they create meaning, circulate meaning, understand meaning, developing research problems and questions, reading and evaluating research, historical methods, yes, that's important, investigates the many attitudes and assumptions about creativity and cultural work. These things caught our attention. Next. And as we were looking at learning objectives also for various classes and what we were doing, we noticed that there were a lot of these same similarities that were coming up. So here you can see the student learning objectives from one course, and then below that for the archival research section, our session summary, we're hitting on a lot of the same types of ideas, especially in terms of inquiry methods, historical inquiry, formulating questions, and so on. Next. Likewise, again, learning objectives and outcomes here between the course and the archival instruction toolkit. You'll see many of the things are similar in terms of information literacy and critical assessment on our end, and what the learning objectives were for this particular class. Next. So convinced that our objectives align with other classes, we concluded that yes, we are a great fit, and there was an epic handshake between the archivists and librarians and the faculty teaching courses, and that kind of launched us into our fall 2020 pilot program with the English class that we did. Claudia?
Epic handshake. That's what it felt like. Every time we had a conversation with Professor Long, it was like, yes.
Yeah, you literally could feel the ground shake with the excitement that she had about partnering with us. It was pretty cool.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to take you through the slide presentation that we did with the class. We're not going to go through it as though we are teaching it to you, so don't worry. We just want to point out the main goals and functions of the archival literacy instruction to really give you an idea of what we mean by the core foundations and embedding those within a presentation that meets the objectives clearly defined for the course. So the little box with the blue, letting you know that this is where we started. So we're giving you the whole spiel here. The agenda, again, setting expectations for the class. And then we wanted to present the objectives, again, setting expectations and really introducing some of these basic concepts to the students. And it is important to remember that before, this was our first session with them, and before that we had given them 2 reading assignments, one on what does an archivist do all day, and the other one about archival silences. So they had come in with a little bit of knowledge, that flipped classroom method that we mentioned earlier. And so this was, again, just to kind of prime their brains with that information that if they did the reading, they had already encountered before coming to the class. And then we set up a portion at the top of the deck for Professor Long to introduce the assignment that was going to be attached to the module. This may or may not be appropriate if you're doing a one-shot, but there's still a way to create some kind of space for a desired outcome, even if it's something small, just as the goal for the end of the session or something. This doesn't have to be as built out or robust as a week-long module assignment. So this is just an example of what Professor Long designed and what we helped her kind of develop for the class. So the impetus for this week's module was what happens when you ask the questions you didn't know to ask. That was how they framed this research method for archival artifact analysis. The week before this, their study was making the ordinary weird or something like that. It's like using strangeness as an analytical tool. So this was kind of rooted in that idea of like, what questions aren't you asking and why aren't you asking them? What's ordinary and what's extraordinary? So kind of weird, kind of weird stuff. But we were able to make it work and really figure out a way to fit in our goal skills. Icebreaker, so people don't feel weird talking to us because we're strangers coming into their classroom. And then we launched into these core concepts right away because you want to make sure that you have time for them, but you also don't want it to be what takes up the bulk of the class. So, just a very basic kind of getting to those questions. What is an archive? What is an archivist? And, taking them through these differentiating terms. I know it can be like pretty contentious, the capital A, lowercase a, S, or no S. So really kind of setting a shared vocabulary for the session is also always a helpful way to think about introducing concepts. And then again, presuming that they have gone through an introduction to the library. This is a library catalog, kind of a similar idea, but not the same as a finding aid for archives. And again, kind of taking them through some more of the, what are you going to find if you are doing this search at your respective institution? So in ASU Library, what is going to happen when you start looking for these resources? What are you going to see? What can you expect? So again, breaking down that wall between I'm scared to even start this because I don't know what to expect. And so I just won't do it at all. And again, vocabulary sharing and just setting an expectation for what you can expect when you look for these things, particularly arrangement. If you have never looked at a finding aid in your life and you see things just listed out with box and folder numbers, that might not mean anything to you without a little bit of support. So again, not going into the whole theory of all of this stuff, but just presenting enough where it's building a certain amount of confidence for students to start to engage with these ideas in a very low risk kind of way. So we took them through what happens if you go into AAO, which is a lot of you are from Texas, so the Taro equivalent for Arizona. And just again, walk them through the various components they would see, really trying to make it clear that this isn't what it's going to look like everywhere, but this is generally what you're going to see when you're using a finding aid to identify appropriate resources for your research. And then talking about what do we mean by resources or sources? We kind of take for granted that as professionals in this field, we go through a lot of this study naturally, but it isn't something that gets covered for everyone everywhere. And so again, kind of leveling that playing field and introducing these concepts to really enable them to feel like they can succeed at these things that may seem a little bit foreign, but are actually going to be required of them, either in an academic setting or in the world when they're trying to read the news or, post something online, write a blog post. I don't know. We live in the future. Anything that you're doing on the internet, it's helpful to know these kinds of terms. And, always making it a little bit relatable with the grumpy cat, RIP, Arizona legend. Always keeps it a little bit exciting. You'll get comments in the chat about things like that. And again, same kind of thing there. But importantly, this is a way to kind of talking about tertiary sources isn't something that happens a lot. And so if I can suggest one thing, it would be talking about how these things, specifically Wikipedia, are not evil. I think things like Wikipedia and textbooks and stuff have gotten a really bad rap recently in the recent academic narrative, but they're helpful ways to start developing a research question. And I think describing their purpose as being a helpful tool, again, is a way to acknowledge that may be where a lot of their knowledge development happens, typing something into Google and getting a Wikipedia page, and not making that be a shame, not making that be shame-based, like, oh, that's not how you do research. Using it as a way to say, that's a great place to get some common knowledge information and maybe find some supporting information there and really launching your research. So I think for me, this just felt really important to include. I've had librarians do the whole, you will not be someone who goes on Wikipedia for my session. And it's like, okay, not helpful. And then we gave them, again, it's a lot of expectation setting, right? Like people don't know what archives are and it can be really scary. So we're trying to really take away some of that like fear factor. So here's what you expect when you go into the reading room. Here's a link to ask an archivist. So it's that hybrid that I mentioned earlier of some of the bibliographic instruction stuff. How do you find us? How do you find collections? But tied together to the concepts that we're wanting to share during the session too. So again, Arizona Archives Online, setting an expectation, the digital repository, library guides. So these are all just screenshots of what you would do if you were sitting alone in your dorm room trying to figure all of this stuff out, or wherever you are. And really giving some kind of directed support, because you wouldn't necessarily know to look at a LibGuide for a A to Z list of databases. That's some pretty like inception level information organization going on there. So again, really being thoughtful about what you're showing them, how it relates to what the outcome of the course is. So then after we went through all of that, we used it as a way to frame it as like, now you know, like success, framing it in really success-based language, you know, again, helps draw student engagement and kind of supports that opportunity-based approach and strength-based approach that we tried to integrate into how we developed and framed this whole project. So then we launched them into a couple of research activities that we did as a class, so the students could just put their responses in the chat. So I'll take you through these later in this presentation, or we will. I'm not sure which one of us is doing it, but this is just to give you a sense of what we shared with them. And then this was the end of the session, and Wednesday in October was going to be the next with critical assessment.
All right, we're gonna switch over here now and look at what we're calling in practice inquiry-based learning, and run you through a couple things real quick. Next slide. So we had an archival literacy exercise, and this is kind of like putting the concepts and skills into practice, where we wanted the students to engage in their learning. And one of the exercises that we used focused on archival literacy skills. We assumed that these concepts were new to everyone in the class, so we would level out the playing ground there, and we designed an activity that would reinforce the information that was shared during the session. We also gave them the chance to discuss the concepts again as we moved on, and that way, if it wasn't clear, we would have an idea and we could kind of stop there and make sure everyone understood everything, and we could address things that weren't necessarily maybe quite correct. Next. So one of the scenarios that we used, you see here, you saw this earlier in an earlier slide, but we pulled an image from the digital repository and asked students two fundamental basic questions. Is this a primary source, and will it meet your research needs? And then another example of this, next slide. We pulled an image from the repository again. This happens to be a photograph of Japanese American children at a school in an internment camp. And we asked the same question: is this a primary source, or questions, and will it meet your research needs? there's a brief statement there, what we want them to do in terms of contextualizing, and gave them some time to go think about this. And then we came back and had a discussion about it. And some of the answers were quite good. And some of the things that students noticed actually surprised all of us. Another type of exercise that we use was in relationship to critical assessment. Next. So we, again, from the digital repository, because we were doing this all online, we found a map. And this one, the record, when you go to the repository, gives you the date created, the creator, and a description. And the question that we posed to the students was, what is not on the map? All we know is that this was a map created by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it's a color map of the Grand Canyon National Park proposed boundaries with animal habitat zones identified from deer, mountain lions, and mountain sheep. So then asked the question of the students and gave them some time to think. And then next slide, we talked about what isn't on the map. And considering that this was of the Grand Canyon region, the map didn't show anything about the indigenous tribes and territories of the 11 federally recognized tribal nations. So we showed them this image, and this leads to discussions about what's not represented, reasons why it wasn't, who makes decisions about what to put on maps and not put on maps, and many, many other questions. Next. That gets us into critical assessment, and Claudia is going to talk to you a little bit about that.
So we also crafted moments where it was more discussion based and not so much, an exercise. So a couple of examples of this were talking about that same idea, leveraging that same conversation around what is not here, or who created it and what does that mean. Addressing questions of the veracity of the source, and if it's a trustworthy institution, does that still mean you need to have a critical eye when you're taking in the information that they're sharing with you? So this is a particular favorite of mine. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it is a pretty wild historical mystery. So this is the original photograph that was uncovered when the Russian government allowed a handful of researchers in to review Stalin's collection in the National Archive. But this was the picture that existed in the moment, contextually in history. This was the photograph that was disseminated. So where did Nikolai go? He fell out of favor with Stalin, was very likely killed in a gulag, and so they just, boom, wiped him out of the photo because of whatever reasons. But this was really pointing to the obvious and pretty prescient issue of, just because this is a photo shared by the government, does that mean that that is a reasonable and trustworthy source writ large? So really kind of having this conversation about if access to the record had not been provided, would we have ever known that there was someone missing from this photo? And what does that mean? So really some of these bigger questions. So taking the time over the arc to get to some of these bigger ideas. And then again, some of you may be familiar with this very recent crisis in institutional trust, but the National Archives ran afoul of some historians because they had edited several of the images for their display for the centennial of women's suffrage movement. And so again, talking to them about this idea, it may not seem like a big deal, right? But this is supposed to be an institution where they are the record keeper, and they modified the record, regardless of their reason or intention or what pressure was applied or what, whatever the circumstance was. It's disconcerting. And we know, well, not everyone knows, but there is language around the fact that there are other government institutions being supported by the National Archives who are not keeping their records, who are actively destroying their records. And so if this is one small thing, is it representative of a bigger thing? So really, inviting that space for, oh man, like I can't just look at this image on its face without thinking about, well, what else could be going on here? And that was really the undertone, the underpinning of the goal of the whole module with Dr. Long, but it's also something that is a critical skill to convey just generally. And so now we're going to go into our most active exercise that we offered that combines both the literacy and critical assessment skills. And we would like to offer the time for you to go and try this on your own if you're interested. So we'll give you about 5 minutes. You can read over the slide, go over to the link, and we can kind of chat about it afterward. So if you're interested, if you're not, that's okay. But we'll give you about 5 minutes to either look at this or to give it a shot.
All right, so after the semester ended, we finally took a breath, or as the semester was ending and when it ended, we were able to take a breath and look back and ask ourselves, was our pilot effective? And we said, well, where did we start? We started with working with Professor Long and developing the module assignments in conjunction so that her course assignments and the instruction went together. So you can see here what the criteria were for the various assignments, the ratings, point value, and so on. Next. And then the big part of it for us, and the nerve-wracking part, was it effective? What did the students think? Was it meaningful for them? And here, this is an email that we received from Ellie, from the professor of the course, and she wanted to share something from one of her students from an assignment that the student had turned in. And when it came down to it, it was a very big success, and it integrated and showed that everything, as we had hoped, turned out quite well. And here in the outcomes, you can see at the bottom in the dotted area, the student went on to say, after he found a photograph, oh, well, the next thing to do would be like to go out into the community and see if I can track down other people in the community who have any information about the person in the photo. And all of us were super excited that this is the thought that ran through the student's mind, because that really showed Claudia, myself, and Allison that what we had presented did work, that the students did learn something that, in this particular case, the student had picked up like one of the most valuable skills in terms of critical analysis and thinking about it. And matter of fact, Claudia was doing the happy dance. Sorry, Claudia, but it was really exciting for all of us to see this type of response in the assignment, and showing that even though the instruction was pushed into a single week and we didn't have a lot of time, it was beneficial. So next. So what did we learn? Many things.
Many, many things, but
It worked. That we can standardize the way that we deliver information, right? So this could be used, it was used in an English class, but we could also use this in other classes across campus, and hopefully in our online programs as well. The students think it's cool once they learn the skills. At the beginning, they were kind of skeptical, but in the end, they're like, oh, this is cool. And equally important, the instructors also thought it was cool. Ellie was super excited that her students had such a good experience, and that, you know, it showed in their work that they did actually learn something from the archival instruction. So yes, we learned a lot, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. You know, time management's always a hard issue, and we were fortunate because the students really wanted to talk, so it took up more time than we had anticipated. Hopefully that'll always be the case, because that's a good sign. Organization is something else to keep in mind. Holding more space for communicating during the session. As we're asking you right now, if you have questions, please chime in rather than waiting to the very end or to the next day or the next activity, because context is so important. And finally, assessment. We'd like to develop better ways to measure efficacy. Metrics are important for this, and it's not something that we really did a whole lot of in the pilot instruction, but that's okay. Next time around, we will.